Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. As I was reflecting on these texts this week, I was thinking about a story, my own life story, my own pilgrimage of faith and vocation. After a convoluted path, I graduated from seminary, Eden, in 2004. And I was so full of expectation and excitement. I went home to Spokane to spend some time with my family before I get that first church and go wherever it is that God was calling me to go. I got a temp job to pay the bills until that would happen. But then I ended up waiting and waiting. That temp job turned into a regular job, and months turned into years. I submitted a number of profiles, and I couldn't get interviews. And I just kept getting those carefully worded letters telling me that I'm no longer under consideration. Those of you who have served on search committees know about that letter because you send a lot of them out. They all sound about the same, so I think you guys are using a template of some sort because I'm like, wow, they all sound the same. Although one church used a different something else, and they did not word it very well. It was like, oh, that really cut that one. Usually it's like, well, you just have different gifts than what we need. That's usually what they say, something like this. But they actually had, this letter actually said, you don't have the gifts we need. And I was just like, oh. Because, you get so many of them, at least when it's really, there's a lot of search and call going on. And this happened again and again. And it was an incredibly difficult time for me. And finally I got to the point where I had practically all but given up. And I was analyzing utility bills for a living, which is a great job if that's what you're into. Sadly, I was not. So I'm sitting at this job. I've been out of seminary for more than 8 years. Once in a while I would do some pulpit supply. And I happened to preach at a small Disciples of Christ congregation that was not too far from the house where I grew up and where my parents still live. Their longtime pastor had retired and they were looking for somebody, but I just went there to preach a couple times for pulpit supply. But they did ask me, well, hey, why don't you go ahead and put your name in? And so I did. I put my name in the hat, but I didn't really expect very much. They weren't an open and firm congregation, so I was like, well, we'll see where this goes. But they liked me, and they decided to hire me. And I started on June 1st, 2013, just a little over 9 years after graduation. So it was a long, long journey to that first call. All in all, I served as their pastor for a little over 8 years before I came here to Iowa. It was long, it was difficult, but God changed my life. In the middle of a time of despair, God opened an unexpected door for me. Here I had been planning to go anywhere in the country. I ended up serving a church that some of my brothers went to school with, kids that went to that church. A lot of the people at that church went to the same high school that I went to. So it was really a very unexpected door that was open. Once again, our Hebrew Bible text deals with covenants. And that's true for almost all the lectionary readings from the Hebrew Bible during this season of Lent. But this passage, Jeremiah 31, contains something unique. It references a new covenant. Though renewed covenant might be a better way to understand it, this renewed covenant won't be violated like the old one was. This renewed covenant will be written on the people's hearts, which means that they will truly own this renewed covenant. They will not break this covenant like they had the previous one. This text from Jeremiah was written during the time of the Babylonian exile, when the people had lost their land, their temple, their king. And they were afraid that they were going to even lose their identity. They couldn't see a way forward. They couldn't see a future for themselves. But the prophet sees God opening an unexpected door. And our epistle reading in Hebrews makes a passing reference to someone named Melchizedek. How many of you know who Melchizedek is? Yeah, I didn't expect anyone would. He's an obscure character from way back in Genesis 14, but then he gets a short little mention again in Psalm 110, and then here in Hebrews. He's referenced 3 times, basically, in the Bible, and they're all very obscure references. In the Genesis text, Abraham, who you remember from a few weeks ago, participates in a great battle between powerful states. He is victorious and ends up with lots of booty, or loot, which he gives a tithe of 1/10 of the loot to Melchizedek, this priest king of Salem. Now, we don't know anything about Melchizedek. We don't know where he came from or what became of him. We don't know how he came to be a priest or a king or why Abraham chose to tithe to him. Now, the ancient world understood priests as officials who interceded with God on behalf of the people. A priest prayed to God on behalf of the people. In this passage from Hebrews, Jesus is identified as a priest, a high priest. And I think we can see why the writer of Hebrews would liken Jesus to Melchizedek, because like Melchizedek, Jesus has no apparent beginning or ending, but is nevertheless a priest of God. But not just any priest. He's a priest appointed by God. He's a priest who knows what our experience is and can sympathize with us. He's a priest that because of his obedience and suffering has won salvation and liberation and healing for all who obey him. Jesus suffered and died, yet rose again and became a means for the salvation and healing and liberation of all. Jesus, our great high priest who identifies with us, who is one with us, is that unexpected door that God opened in a time when we could not see any future for ourselves. And talking about that future, that thought continues in our gospel reading from John, which has a group of Greeks wanting to see Jesus. Now, oddly enough, we never find out if these Greeks were ever able to speak to Jesus. Instead, we are told that Jesus responds by saying, well, my hour has come. This is the hour where Jesus is to be glorified. Now, in the 4th gospel, being glorified doesn't mean quite what we would think it means, because in the 4th gospel, it means something like Jesus' death and his resurrection. That's how he's glorified. That's not exactly the way we would normally think of being glorified, but that's what John means when John says that. And this message is for all peoples, Gentiles as well as Jews, and that's why Greeks are referenced here. Jesus tells a parable about how a seed must die to be able to produce fruit. I'm sure many of the farmers are like, you know, Chris, that isn't actually the way that works. I'm like, I know, it's a metaphor, Because if it really died, well, nothing would be popping out of the ground, would it? Jesus reports that his glorification, his being lifted up, will draw all people to him. Now, it's a little ambiguous if being lifted up refers to his crucifixion or if it refers to his resurrection. But it could also be that the author is playing with that and basically hinting at both, right? Either way, Jesus, through his suffering and his death, becomes that unexpected door for all peoples. Whether it was me waiting and waiting for that first call to ministry? Or was the Jews hopeless in Babylon without a way forward? Or the followers of Jesus who were dispirited and broken, that Jesus had been struck down by the powers of this world? All of them felt like our way was blocked, like we had no future, there was no way forward. But God created a pathway forward where none had existed before. Hope came from hopelessness, faith came from doubt, and a place to serve for those who felt rejected. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, first off, if we're in a tough spot, we can hold on to hope, knowing that God is at work in our lives and in the world. God is going to open that unexpected door for us. We can be free from hopelessness, knowing that that is secure, that God will open that door. Second, we need to be ready for that open door. If I had terminated my ordination process and given up entirely, I wouldn't have been able to take advantage of that door that God opened. We need to be prepared to act when the time comes. Just like the disciples following Jesus, just like me taking a job as a minister after so long. And I must say, I spent a lot of time in prayer after that church hired me. I'm like, gosh, God, can I even do this? Am I crazy or what? Apparently I'm crazy. But we need to be ready. We need to be able to step through that door when God opens it for us. We can't let our fears hold us back. The third thing that we receive is we receive peace. Because yes, our current situation can be very difficult. And yes, responding to the door that God is opening can be tough. It can be challenging. It can be scary. And yes, we can feel overwhelmed by the whole project. But we are reminded through it all that God is first and foremost about God and God's goodness. God is the one ultimately in charge of bringing healing and liberation and salvation to this world. Knowing that God is in charge of the process brings us peace, because it's not our job to worry. There's a great saying that I remind myself of periodically, because it's important for us as the church to think about this, and it's easy to get discouraged. We are not called to be successful, whatever that means. We are called to be faithful. And once you realize that, that gives us so much peace. So many times church people worry so much about being successful, whatever that means, when we really just need to worry about being faithful, because that's what we're called to. God is at work in our lives and in this world. And we have no need to despair, because God's power can open doors in the most unexpected places, and we can have hope, we can have peace. We just need to be ready to respond and walk through that open door.